and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we're back with another interview to talk about the future of the environment and our relationship with it. We're fortunate to have Philip Loring, who's the Arrell Chair in Food Policy and Society at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And he has a new book, Finding Our Niche, which explores the cultural barriers to a harmonious relationship with nature. And he writes in there that reconciliation takes hard work at all levels, from federal governments to within individuals' hearts and minds. It requires that we dismantle our existing imbalanced systems of power and privilege, give the land back to Indigenous peoples, and then trust rather than fear what those actions will mean for us settlers. So how we reshape our society will reshape our relationship with nature. And I'll tell you, his book is a real pleasure to read. It reminded me a lot of the meditative writings of Barry Lopez. So let's explore these ideas with Phil. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
Oh, I'm really well. Thanks for having me here. I appreciate it.
You know, I also want to do another quote from the book before we start, and that is the mission you described. You wrote that, "I believe that people are hungry for good news and optimism to fuel their own actions and ambitions. With this book, my focus is on reading on stories of healing, growth, and transformation, stories that make real and durable change seem both tangible and achievable." I couldn't agree more. I think we really need to orient ourselves to the future. Why did you write this book, Finding Our Niche, right now?
Well, that's a good start. And, when I sat down I started writing Finding Our Niche when I was still a graduate student. And my work at that time was focusing on really looking for what I thought were going to be these unicorns, these win-win stories, these win-win scenarios where people and nature were thriving together. And the more I looked around, the more I realized they were much more common than I had thought. I went to graduate school, wanted to change the world, wanted to save the world, and with, big savior dreams, and which we can talk about. But then I learned that people were already doing this on their own terms and in their own ways around the world. And it's so different than the stories we often hear and tell ourselves about human nature and about how all of our actions are harmful and we need to reduce our action, reduce our footprint, leave nature alone. There are people all over the world who are rejecting that traditional thinking about environmental problems and finding ways to thrive with nature, to cooperate with the wild, to become part of it again. And so I realized I had to tell some of these stories, and I had to tell them in a way that resonated both in terms of solutions, but also in terms of our personal role in the way we think and live.
So you began your career as an anthropologist and wanted to be adopted by an Indigenous community. It's a common theme amongst anthropologists. But in order to do so, you have to change the way you think about everything by immersing yourself in those communities. So how important is expanding our mental horizons beyond the assumptions, what we think we can take for granted in our home culture when seeking to address climate change and a change in society?
Yeah, it's a really important story that I spent a lot of time sort of grappling with. It is something of an unspoken badge of achievement. At least it used to be in anthropology to develop such good relations with a particular tribe or organization that they would bring you in and think of you as one of their own. And I didn't realize, as a graduate student, how appropriative that idea was. But I was getting at some aspect of my own disquiet there, and my own, the sense that I lacked some aspect of my own way of thinking to better think about these problems. And to your question, at the heart of it is just the question of worldview, of knowing that there's not one right way to know or understand this world. They can all, Western science, sort of intuitive thinking, Indigenous ways of knowing, that it can all get us closer to knowing the world, but they all only offer a partial picture. And if we want to know and learn and understand the world as much as we have to live more sustainably in it, especially in a world that is so full of people with so many critical challenges, we need to be willing to work with multiple ways of knowing, to partners who see the world differently. And instead of saying there must be one right way and either I am right or you're right, to acknowledge that these are just different lenses on the world that have their strengths, their weaknesses. And if we conflict, that means there's something that we don't understand yet.
So what can we learn by looking at the world through Indigenous eyes? To my mind, and you refer to Indigenous people and settlers, but if you look at a really long view, Indigenous people are earlier settlers because we all came from Africa. They're all entering a new territory. So how can we open our minds to what they already learned and learned so long ago?
Well, this is a really, really great point. We often think about human history, at least among Western cultures, being relatively short and recent. And the problems that we've created as people are not indicative of the entirety of human history. They're indicative of about 1% of it at best. And so there's a lot of lived experience and oral tradition that our culture forgot, wanted to reject, believed was unimportant, about how to live and how to relate to one another, how to relate to the land. And the Indigenous collaborators that I work with often talk about a notion of two-eyed seeing, where you are trying to achieve through collaboration and developing an ethical space for collaboration where you trust one another and you accept the differences in the ways you see the world, to have a better dialogue and build better relations with each other and with the world. And that is the number one lesson that I've been taught by the Indigenous people I've worked with, is that if we want to achieve a more sustainable future, we have to be in better relations with each other people, and better relations with the world.
How did their mythologies inform that perspective, in your opinion?
Well, there's story, oral tradition is a very powerful way of passing on lessons about how to live in the world. And I've encountered over the years many stories that are very clearly stories about how to live better, how to live more sustainably. I talk about one in the book that has been told to me a number of times, about the story of the girl who swam with the fishes. And as I say in the book, it's not my story. I'm not an Athabascan person, so it's not mine to tell, but I can talk about what I learned from it. And that is that, there is wisdom in the world all around us about how to live better. The rules are already there. We don't need to make new scientific discoveries. We aren't waiting for some secret knowledge. That we know the rules of how to live better. They're in the patterns of interactions between fish and animals and people and insects. They're in very fast things like relationships between predator and prey. They're in the very slow periods of forest fire, disturbance, and recovery. We just need to be willing to look at it.
The other thing I really appreciated of the book was your critique of Star Trek. And at one point you talked about Gene Roddenberry's perspective, that he recognized that our human nature is not inherently destructive, and that opened entirely new possibilities for how we think about the future. And how would you characterize our use of our current mythologies in recasting our approach to the world? There's Star Trek. In my mind, there's three great mythos driving Western culture right now, which is the Marvel multiverse, Star Trek, and Star Wars, from a culture perspective. But only Star Trek really says we can really do better.
Right.
On the other hand, every time the Star Trek crew showed up, it was exploring places no one had ever been. There were people there. That was the interaction. What did you think we can use science fiction, or at least speculative fiction, to do to help us rethink things?
I think that science fiction and speculative fiction is central to how we think about the world, because again, stories are so central to who we are as a being, as a species. And I love Star Trek. The thing that Star Trek did that I talk about in the book is that it gave me a very sort of lone white hero understanding of how you make change. And it wasn't until later that I realized that it's teams, not individuals, and that make change. You mentioned Star Wars, and we have our culture, our Western culture, is very oriented around the hero's journey. And the hero has to fall, they have to go into the cave, they have to return with some special power or knowledge to bestow their solution upon the world. And that's not the only kind of journey. I talked about the girl who swam with the fishes, and that is a very different kinds of hero's journey, because she doesn't return. She returns from this experience where she's been reborn as a fish with knowledge about how to treat the fish better and live more sustainably. But it's not her that is saving her community. It's the people in the community empowered with the knowledge they need, making their own communities more ethical and sustainable and just. So it's not an individual hero, it's a collective hero. And that's a change that I think is really important in terms of how we think about leadership, how we move past what I would call into a post-heroic form of change in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that your acknowledgement that we keep coming at this as the great man with the plan approach to solving our problems, rather than saying, open up our conversation, get a group together and solve the problem. We just resist that. It's like, tell us what to do. So that all comes back to metaphor. And I've spent years reading George Lakoff's work on metaphor and how it shapes our perception of the world. And another writer who's important, and I think you clearly have read him as well, is Stuart Brand, who has written that the Earth's going to be fine. It's us that's in trouble. So when we go back to thinking about indigenous cultures and what we can learn, they live more lightly on the land. What are the metaphors that get you to think more about living lightly rather than being heavy or extractive?
I think, I don't know if living more lightly is quite the right metaphor.
Okay.
I think living with more intent and care is a better metaphor, because there have been really wonderful studies that have come out in the last few years that have confirmed what Indigenous people have been telling us for a long time, that Indigenous people interacted with ecosystems in extensive ways, through fire, through hunting, through active cultivation of beaches. These were major changes to ecosystems, major contributions to ecosystems, but they worked in a way that promoted rather than undermined biodiversity. And so participation, participating in the ecosystem, for me, is a much better metaphor than trying to leave it alone.
That's fascinating. Now, and participation, again, is openness to those life forms and all the life around you as equal, rather than down there, we're taking care of it.
It's very different than control. It's very different than trying to control and architect things and assuming that if we only know enough and have the right systems, that we can manage it in a way that we're never going to be at risk.
So by allowing or creating room for other species to thrive, we can actually contribute to the solution.
Yes. Absolutely. It doesn't have to be a win-lose, where if we let the wild back into our cities and our lives, and if we stop trying to eliminate the wild from our agricultural spaces, it doesn't have to be a net loss, right? It can be, and we see this in agroecology, that if you it takes time because there's a lot to correct, but if you let the wild back in, all of the tremendous agricultural biodiversity that existed in the world for the last thousands of years was the result of a willing interplay between cultural systems and wild systems. It wasn't because we tried to keep weeds and pests out. It was because of cross-pollination. Right. And so there's an interaction there. It's generative. It's not a trade-off. But our culture has always treated it like a trade-off. We need the herbicides and the pesticides so we can focus on the thing that we want. Right.
And to conquer and control nature too.
Right.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that's really nice about the book is you don't just do indigenous cultures that we normally identify, although you do, but you also looked at, for instance, the behavior of people in the Burren, which is an Irish region that is essentially indigenous. Can you talk a little about what was going on with the Haida Watchmen in British Columbia who watch for environmental changes and essentially raise a flag to say we need to do something in order to be responsive to this? What did you learn from hanging around with these folks?
Well, I've spent a lot of time with people in a number of different cultural contexts. You're right, indigenous and non, with people whose lives and livelihoods and well-being is so closely coupled to the places where they live that they strike me as sort of a sentinel, in the sense of a sentinel species. On the one hand, the canary in the coal mine. If something's wrong in the environment, you can see the problem in the bird. When as beings, our health and well-being is the embodiment of our lived experiences and the world around us. And so the farmers in the burn, their livelihoods are so coupled to that land. The Haida in Haida Gwaii off the coast of British Columbia are likewise. Their well-being and their future is immensely coupled to the well-being of that land and that seascape. And so this notion of being a sentinel in the sort of the representative sense, but also in the active sense of being the watchman. And the watchman programs have really flourished over the last few years among Indigenous communities, for example, in Canada, and who are saying the best way we have to continue to cope with things like climate change, protect, manage, steward, and live on this land is by being out there, by paying attention, by continuing to engage with it. Ecological knowledge is a process. It's an ongoing process. The best way you have to adapt to something changing is to be there while it's changing, so you can learn from it and respond to it. And so I find this notion of sentinels, that you can have sentinel communities where people are so fully coupled and in such good relationship with the place they live, that it's almost like an indicator. Things are okay here.
So it just occurred to me that maybe really what we need to do is learn to be Indigenous, to actually open ourselves to our region and to our place and become attuned to it. So the question I wanted to ask is, can we help by becoming attuned to our ecosystem, even in a city or a town? And how would you suggest starting to do that?
Yeah, a number of people have talked about this, and it's a tricky terrain because there's so much politics and power and historical legacy of being a settler, right? To think about what it means. Can we ever be, to use the words of Gary Snyder, can we ever be native to this place? Mm-hmm. And because it's, maybe politically different, but that doesn't mean that we can't, as I said before, try to become in better relations with the place and its original inhabitants, the people that came here before us. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a wonderful Indigenous writer, and in Braiding Sweetgrass, she says something similar. She talks about recovering nativeness, mm-hmm. Which is, sort of aligns with when I talk about trying to let the wild back in. The wild, predators, weeds, all the things about the wild world that we think of as risky and dangerous, they're very much an anathema to our current version of Western civilization. And I think if we can learn to let the wild back in to these spaces and into our lives and realize it's not a risk per se, it's just part of participating in an ecosystem, that goes far towards the kind of returning to some level of nativeness here.
And risk is what makes life actually interesting. But the great man with the plan, the only I can save you guys, mm-hmm. Really are trying to reduce everything down to the simplest possible state. They create monocultures. They eliminate conflict by destroying potential opponents rather than embracing and understanding how to live with those people or places. So as you think about educating youth today in particular, what do you advise them to start to think about when they go out into the world to make their differences? At the beginning of the conversation, you said when you started your career, you wanted to go out and save the world. Mm-hmm. What do you tell kids that want to save the world today? Well,
I try, and I encounter this question every year when I face a fresh room of undergraduate students in my food system sustainability class, for example, and they're all passionate and they're all driven, and always their hearts are always in the right place, and they always have ideas, and they're always so further along in thinking about what's next than I was at their age, and so that's encouraging. And I think that the thing to do is to try to help them see these persistent cultural myths that we continue to perpetuate in our lives that are still in the way of living things a little differently. And if you can get them to see them and recognize them, like the myth that environmental problems are simply because people are just somehow broken or inherently unsustainable or greedy or always only acting in self-interest, and if you can even just sort of drive a little bit of a wedge or crack the veneer on those deep-seated cultural myths that are so important, it changes the whole horizon for what's possible and how to solve those problems. And so that's where I focus my energy. And then what I do with, I think that there's lots of ways that that people, young people, people of any age can try to reorient their actions and strategies around solving these problems. There are things we can do in our own lives. There's always things that we can do in our own lives, and those are important ethically. They're important to who we are and the kind of life we live. But many of these problems are just so large and so systemic. We cannot be tricked by the larger proponents of the larger status quo that's how we're going to solve these problems. That the world would be different if only we were better consumers, right? And so I also try to really emphasize systems and help people learn how to see systems. Because if you don't see systems, you don't believe in things like systemic racism. You have to see the systems first, and they're right there in front of you, but we've learned to see past them. Daniel Quinn called them the bars of the cage. And Ishmael, they've been there so long we don't see them anymore. It's like the eyeglasses on your face.
We're like the prisoners in Plato's cave in that sense.
Right, exactly. And so I try to focus on learning to see and then systems, because once you see systems, you can see leverage points.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that's where the biggest changes can be made.
It's interesting because I heard the Hopi myth when I was young. And until a moment ago, I've always thought of it as a story that was finished. But myth is never finished. It's something that's active and constantly going on around you. And the challenge of restoring nature, we keep talking about it like we'll be done with it in 2050, but that's the wrong thing. Are we ever going to be finished with restoring nature? And how would you go about preparing people for that constant improvement in our relationship with the world?
The world is a diverse tapestry of ongoing patterns of slow and fast change. The changes we're faced now are different because they're directional, they're caused by fossil fuels. But change is a part of our lives, and it will be a part of our lives. But will we ever be done? I've come, and this is my next project, I've come to think about this in terms of that we face not just one, but we face two major transitions as a society. The first is pulling up in the plane, that we're in a tailspin, things are crashing, and we need to pull out of that tailspin while also rebuilding the plane that we're flying, because the plane that we're flying happens to be built to crash, right? And we just didn't know it. We haven't known it. And so that's the first transition. How do we get out of these major challenges that we're facing, that people are already experiencing, loss of life and food insecurity and hunger because of climate change, because of climate instability, because of politics and conflict. That's the first transition. But we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that the systems of the future, the food systems of the future, the communities of the future need to be designed around the pathologies of the present, right? So after we solve the problems, after we get out of the danger zone with as little loss of life as possible, then our children and our children's children and grandchildren have the next transition in front of them, where they can, once freed from the duress, so to speak, they can say, what kind of world do we want to live in? Explore
possibility.
Right. And that's what I keep that one in mind when I try to do my own work. And when I look at solutions like, Elon Musk wanting to become interplanetary, and Jeff Bezos saying just ship, having an epiphany when he's in outer space and saying, let's just ship all our pollution there. Or people talking about, nuclear solutions or doubling down on industrial agriculture, so-called eco-modernism. They're looking at right now. I want to look at the next transition and say, let's make sure we don't cut them off. We don't create path dependence for them, limit their options in the emergency room medicine that we do now, if that makes sense.
No, I think the emergency medicine is an excellent metaphor, because we literally are always just barely saving ourselves. It's that cliffhanger. The wheels get clipped off the plane by the mountaintop, and then next week we'll find out what happened.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the mode of our media today too.
Exactly.
Which just constantly reinforces that. Phil, I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope everybody will read your book.
I hope so too. But I really appreciate you having me on here. It's been nice talking to you. Yeah.
We've been talking with Philip Loring. He's the Arrell Chair of Food Policy and Society at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And his new book, Finding Our Niche, is available now. You can order it from your favorite bookstore. Take some time to read it. It really is a fun read when you get into the details of the cultural engagement that Phil undertook. And also, folks, take a moment to share this podcast with your friends. Let's get people thinking about this, and let's change this world for the better. We'll be back with another innovator interview soon. My name's Mitch Ratcliffe, your host. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911 podcast. Take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.